She had the locks changed while he was still at the office. That was the part that stayed with Elliot Vance longest. Not the boxes stacked on the front porch in the Atlanta rain, not the security guard who wouldn't meet his eyes, not even Mara standing in the doorway of the house he had helped pay for. Her arms crossed, her expression carrying the particular coldness of someone who had been rehearsing this moment for months. It was the locks. She hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't left a note. She had simply called a locksmith sometime between 9 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon and erased 16 years of his presence from the place he still thought of as home. If you've ever been quietly removed from something you helped build, a marriage, a business, a life, then stay with me. Drop a like, leave a comment with the city or country you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because this story goes somewhere nobody in that house could have predicted. And the name at the bottom of that contract? Nobody bothered to read it, not until it was far too late. The rain had been coming down since noon. Elliot noticed it during his second meeting of the day, a vendor call with a textiles distributor out of Charlotte who kept losing his audio connection. He remembered watching the water streak down the conference room glass on the 14th floor of the Vance Apparel building and thinking, absently, that he needed to check whether the gutter on the east side of the house had been cleared. He had meant to do it 2 weekends ago and kept forgetting. He would not need to worry about that gutter after today. The call ended at 3:40. He rode the elevator down, said goodnight to the woman at the front desk whose name was Patricia and who always kept a bowl of butterscotch candies beside her keyboard, and walked to the parking deck. He drove the 12 minutes home through the kind of gray Atlanta afternoon that presses down on everything, the kind that makes every traffic light feel longer than it is. He turned onto Whitmore Lane and saw the boxes before he saw anything else. 4 of them. Brown cardboard, the kind you get from a liquor store or a grocery run, sealed with packing tape and stacked unevenly on the covered portion of the front porch. His laptop bag was propped against the largest box. His winter coat, the charcoal one he hadn't worn since February, was folded on top. Elliot sat in the car for a moment with the engine running. He thought, there must be some explanation. Then he got out and walked to the front door and put his key in the lock, and the key did not turn. He tried it twice. Slow, then fast, then slow again, the way you do when you're certain you must be doing something wrong and equally certain that you are not. The deadbolt had been replaced. He could see it now. The brass finish was newer than the rest of the hardware, shinier, without the small scratch near the keyhole that his key had made years ago when he'd come home late from a business trip and missed the slot in the dark. He rang the doorbell. He waited. He rang it again. The door opened, but not all the way. A chain lock, also new, held it to about 4 inches, and through that gap he could see Mara's face, or the portion of it that she allowed him to see. One eye, the sharp line of her jaw. She was wearing the ivory blouse she saved for important days. Mara. His voice came out steadier than he felt. What is this? I think it's self-explanatory, she said. You changed the locks. Elliot, you changed the locks on our house. It's my house. She said it without raising her voice, which was somehow worse. My name is on the deed. You can confirm that with your attorney if you'd like. He stood in the rain. He had stepped off the porch without realizing it, and looked at her through a 4-inch gap in a door he had walked through 10,000 times. The porch light was on behind her. He could hear, faintly, the sound of a television from somewhere inside. We need to talk about this, he said. I'm done talking, Elliot. Everything you need for the next few weeks is in those boxes. The rest of your things can be arranged through Mara. He took 1 step back toward the porch. Open the door. No. Open the door and let's have a conversation like, I said no. The single eye he could see did not blink. This is over. This has been over for a long time, and you know it. He didn't know it. That was the honest answer. That was the thing he would sit with for months afterward. The fact that he had not known it, or had not let himself know it, and he wasn't sure which of those was worse. Is someone in there with you? He asked. A pause. Half a second too long. My mother is here, Mara said. He thought about that. Eleanor Whitfield, Mara's mother, who had never fully decided what she thought of Elliot and had spent 16 years in that indecision, sometimes warming toward him, and sometimes watching him from across a dinner table with an expression he could never quite decode. Can I speak to her? There's nothing to discuss, Elliot. You should call someone to come get you. Get me? I have my car. I need... He stopped himself, breathed. I need my laptop. I have work tomorrow morning, Mara. Real work. The kind that keeps this company running. Your laptop is on the porch. He looked. It was. He hadn't noticed it in the bag. This isn't over, he said. You know that. Call your attorney, she said, and closed the door. He stood on the porch in the rain and listened to the deadbolt turn. He drove to his brother Marcus's house in Decatur, which took 40 minutes in the rain and construction on I-20. Marcus was 2 years older and worked in commercial real estate and had never particularly interfered in Elliot's marriage, which Elliot had always appreciated. When he opened the door and saw Elliot standing there with a laptop bag and a soaked coat, Marcus didn't ask any questions. He just stepped back and held the door open wider. I'll put sheets on the guest bed, he said. I don't need sheets yet, Elliot said. I need to understand what happened. Okay. Marcus got 2 beers from the refrigerator. He didn't ask if Elliot wanted one. He just put them on the kitchen table and sat down. Tell me what you know. What Elliot knew was not very much, and what he suspected was considerably more than he had wanted to admit. He talked for 45 minutes. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was one of his better qualities. By the time Elliot finished, both beers were empty and the rain against the kitchen window had softened to something quieter. The thing about Damon Cross, Marcus said carefully. What about him? You've mentioned him 4 times in the last hour. Once when you talked about last spring's vendor restructuring. Once when you talked about the Holloway account. Once when you talked about that acquisition meeting you weren't invited to. And just now. Elliot looked at this beer bottle. I noticed he's been around a lot. Around Mara? Around the office, around the company decisions, around everything. He turned the bottle in his hands. He's the COO, that's his job. Sure, Marcus said. And what's your job? Financing, operations, the structural side. Right. So when the COO is making structural decisions without the financing guy in the room, what does that mean? Elliot didn't answer because the answer was obvious and he had been avoiding it. Damon Cross had arrived at Vance Apparel 14 months ago with an MBA from Emory and a reputation as a turnaround specialist. Someone who came into struggling mid-sized companies and reorganized them into something a larger player could acquire. That was the framing when Mara brought him in. Elliot had reviewed his credentials and found them legitimate. He had sat across from Damon in the first week and found him polished and direct and perhaps slightly too comfortable in a company that wasn't his, but that could have been personality, and Elliot had told himself it was personality. He had been telling himself a lot of things. He's been pushing Mara toward the acquisition, Elliot said. The Callaway Group deal, $100 million. Marcus went still. $100 million. They want Vance Apparel. Mara wants to sell a controlling share. She's been framing it as a growth opportunity, but... He stopped. But you don't own a controlling share, Marcus said. Not personally. No. So who does? And here was the part that Elliot had been coming to, the part he had been circling for the last hour without quite landing on it. He set the beer bottle down. The Vance Legacy Trust does, he said. I set it up 7 years ago. After the IPO fell through and we had that rough period. You remember, I thought we might lose everything. I wanted to protect the company's structure. I worked with an attorney and we established a trust that holds my founding equity and my voting rights. I'm the authorized decision maker. Marcus stared at him. Mara knows this? She was there when we set it up. I went through it with her, but you know Mara. He said it without bitterness, just fact. She's not a documents person. She's a vision person. She builds relationships. She walks into a room and makes people believe in something. The operational paperwork has always been, he paused, mine. So the acquisition can't close without my authorization. That's written into the trust documents, and it's written into the company's shareholder agreement. Elliot was quiet for a moment. I don't think Mara knows that. I think she may have assumed the trust was administrative, and I think Damon may have told her that getting rid of me was the cleanest way to move forward. Marcus leaned back. Damon told her to throw you out. I don't know that. What do you think? Elliot looked at the window. The rain had almost stopped. I think, he said slowly, that someone put it in her head that she built this company alone. And she believed it. And I think that someone has a reason to want this acquisition to go through very fast, before anybody looks closely at the numbers. I didn't sleep well. He rarely did in unfamiliar beds, and the guest room at Marcus's house had a ceiling fan that clicked on every third rotation with a small, irregular sound that he kept expecting to stop. He got up at 5:30 and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and started working through files he hadn't looked at in weeks. Not because he had been careless, he had always paid attention, but because in the past 6 months, his access to certain internal systems had been quietly downgraded. He had noticed. He had raised it once with the IT director, a soft-spoken man named Gerald, who had looked uncomfortable and said he would look into it. Nothing had changed. What Elliot found in those early morning hours, working through the documents he still had access to, was not proof of anything. Not yet. But it was the shape of something. There were vendors in the quarterly reports he didn't recognize. 3 of them, all added in the past 10 months, all in the supply chain infrastructure, fabric sourcing, logistics intermediaries, packaging suppliers. The amounts they'd been paid were not individually enormous, but they were consistent and they were growing. And when he searched for their business registrations, he found them through 2 layers of holding companies before the trail became difficult to follow on his own. He wrote their names down on a piece of Marcus's notepad. Then he opened his email and found, buried under 2 weeks of threads he'd been copied on but not central to, a message from his sister-in-law. Nora Whitfield, Mara's younger sister, the one who had studied accounting and now worked in Atlanta's nonprofit sector, had sent him a message 4 days ago. The subject line was blank. The message read, "We should talk before Thursday. Not about the divorce. About the other thing. Call me when you can." He had missed it. He had been in Charlotte for 2 days with the textiles distributor, and when he came back there had been a board presentation, and then the vendor call, and then the drive home in the rain, and the locked door and the boxes on the porch. He looked at the message for a long time. Before Thursday. Today was Tuesday. He called her at 6:15 in the morning, expecting voicemail. She picked up on the second ring. "I've been waiting," Nora said. Her voice was tense in the particular way of someone who has been holding something too long and is relieved to have somewhere to put it down. "How much do you know?" "I'm learning," Elliot said. "Tell me what you know." A pause on her end. He heard her move to another room, a door closing. "Mara doesn't know I'm calling you," Nora said. "She can't. If she finds out, she'll—" Another pause. "It's complicated with my family. It's always complicated." "I understand." "I'm not sure you do, but I'm going to tell you anyway because—" She stopped. "Because somebody should have said something earlier, and I waited too long, and I'm not willing to wait anymore." What Nora told him over the next 30 minutes was not a complete picture, but it was enough of one. She had been at a family dinner 6 weeks ago. Mara and Eleanor and Nora, the 3 of them, a Sunday thing they did occasionally at Eleanor's house in Buckhead. Damon Cross had come to that dinner, not as a business associate, as something less easily categorized. He and Mara had not been publicly affectionate, Nora said, but the way he sat in that dining room, the way he refilled Mara's glass before she asked, the way Eleanor watched him with something that looked like relief. All of it told a story. After dinner, Nora had stayed to help with dishes. Eleanor had gone out to the garden. Nora had overheard a phone call Damon made in the hallway. Not all of it, but enough. He said, "Once the money clears, I'm gone," Nora told Elliot. Those words exactly. "Once the money clears, I'm gone." And then he said someone's name, a woman's name, not Mara's, and he laughed. Elliot sat in the kitchen with the notepad in front of him and the 3 vendor names written in his own handwriting and felt something very cold and very clear settle in his chest. "He's planning to take the money," he said. Not a question. "I think so. I think the vendors are his. I think he's been moving money out of the company through them for almost a year. And I think the acquisition is the final move, a big enough event to cover the last transfer before he disappears." "Why didn't you tell Mara?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "I tried, 3 weeks ago. She told me I was jealous. She told me I had always been jealous of what she'd built, and that I was trying to sabotage the biggest deal of her life." Her voice was even, but just barely. "She didn't let me finish a sentence." Elliot looked at the ceiling. "And your mother?" "My mother wants this deal to happen. She has for months. Nora stopped. "There may be some financial arrangement there too. I don't have proof. But my mother has been spending differently in the last year. New car. Renovation on the kitchen. I asked her about it once and she said she'd made some investments. Elliot wrote Eleanor Payments. He underlined it. Nora, he said, I need you to be willing to say this to the board. Another pause, longer this time. If I do that, she said, Mara will never forgive me. If you don't, Elliot said, she'll lose everything to a man who is never going to stay. The line was quiet for a long time. When is the board meeting? Nora asked. Thursday. Mara scheduled it 2 weeks ago. It's supposed to be the final approval meeting for the acquisition. Then I'll be there, Nora said. But Elliot, you need to be there too, whatever that costs you. He looked at the vendor names on the notepad. He thought about the locks, the brass shine of the new deadbolt, the 4-inch gap, the one eye looking at him through the chain. I'll be there, he said. Wednesday passed in a controlled kind of motion that felt nothing like calm. Elliot spent the morning with an attorney he trusted, not the company's retained counsel, but a private attorney named Sandra Hewitt, who had helped him structure the Vance Legacy Trust 7 years ago, and who, when he explained the situation, went very quiet in the way of someone filing information into a serious place. The trust is airtight, she told him. Your authorization is required for any ownership transfer, any acquisition of controlling interest, and any change to voting structure. Mara cannot close this deal without you. Does she know that? She should. She was present for the trust establishment, but if she hasn't reviewed those documents in 7 years, Sandra spread her hands. She hasn't, Elliot said. I can promise you that. Then she may have received counsel that was incomplete, or she may have received counsel that was deliberately incomplete. Sandra looked at him directly. Elliot, if Damon Cross advised her that your interest in the company was not blocking, he either doesn't know corporate law or he was lying to her. Which is more likely? He has a finance background and a business degree. He knows corporate law. She paused. So. He spent the afternoon tracking what he could find on the 3 vendors. With Sandra's help and a forensic accountant she brought in on short notice, a precise, unhurried man named Daniel Park, who worked from a laptop and asked questions in a quiet sequence that never felt like accusation. They built a partial picture of where the money had gone. Partial, but substantial. More than $6 million over 10 months, filtered through intermediaries to accounts that appeared to be controlled by entities connected to a family name that was not Damon Cross, but that appeared frequently alongside it in public business records. Family money, hidden in the supply chain, growing steadily, then accelerating in the last 3 months as the acquisition talks gained momentum. He was getting ready to move, Daniel said, looking at the timeline he'd built. This pattern, the acceleration, you see this when someone is preparing an exit. Nora sent a document that evening. She had kept notes. She was an accountant's daughter and had been trained to keep notes, she said, and she had written down the conversation she overheard the night of the family dinner, dated and time-stamped. And she had also found 3 photographs taken at a restaurant 2 months ago where Damon was seated with a woman who was not Mara and who appeared, from the pictures and the public social media profile Nora had located, to be based in Miami. Elliot looked at the photographs for a moment and then put them down. He was not interested in the personal dimensions of what Damon had or had not done to Mara's life in that way. That was Mara's to process when she got there. What he was interested in was the document Nora had also attached, a screenshot of a text exchange between Damon and an unknown number, obtained from Nora's own phone, where Damon had accidentally sent a message to the wrong contact. The message read, "Trust docs are buried. She never reads anything. We're clear." Elliot read it twice. She never reads anything. He closed the laptop and sat for a while in the quiet of Marcus's guest room. He thought about Mara at 28, walking into the tiny storefront on Auburn Avenue that would become Vance Apparel, her eyes moving across the space with that particular quality she had, the ability to see what something could be before it existed. He thought about the first collection, the all-nighter they'd pulled together in that back room, him running the numbers on a folding table while she arranged samples on a rack and argued with him about whether ivory was a sellable color in August. She had been right about the ivory. She had been right about a lot of things. And she had been wrong about him. Not in the way she thought, but wrong. Because the person she'd been looking at for the last 14 months, looking at through Damon Cross's carefully positioned frame, wasn't Elliot. It was a version of Elliot that someone else had built for her. A liability. A dead weight. A signature on paperwork that nobody important needed to bother reading. He picked up his phone. He had one more call to make before Thursday. He called Gerald in IT at 7:30 that evening. Gerald was surprised to hear from him, then was quiet through a careful explanation of what Elliot had found, then said, in the small, honest voice of someone who has been waiting for permission to tell the truth, that yes, his access had been downgraded. In November. On Damon Cross's direct instruction. Gerald had flagged it internally and been told it was a restructuring decision. He had a paper trail if Elliot needed it. I need it, Elliot said. Send it to this email. He gave Sandra's address. Elliot, Gerald said, what's going to happen tomorrow? Elliot looked at the notepad. At the vendor names, the questions about Eleanor, the underlined words and the circled numbers, and the slow, careful architecture of everything that had been built around him without his knowledge. The truth, he said. That's what's going to happen. He hung up and looked at the clock. 18 hours until the board meeting. He opened his laptop and began to prepare. He slept 3 hours and woke up before the alarm. Not because he was rested, he wasn't, but because his body had apparently decided that sleep was no longer useful and had moved on without consulting him. He lay in the dark of Marcus's guest room, listening to the ceiling fan click, and thought about the board meeting with the specific, grinding focus of someone who knows that preparation is the only thing standing between them and disaster. At 4:45, he got up, made coffee in Marcus's kitchen without turning on the overhead light, and sat at the table with his laptop and the yellow notepad and went through everything one more time. Sandra had sent a summary document at midnight. She had clearly not slept either, organizing the evidence into categories. The vendor trail. The access restriction paper trail from Gerald. Nora's written account. The photographs. The misdirected text message. And the trust documents themselves, which Sandra had pulled from the original filing and annotated in the margins with the precision of someone who had spent the night building a case, which was exactly what she had been doing. The case was not perfect. Cases built in 48 hours rarely are. There were gaps, amounts that could be explained away, connections that were suggestive rather than definitive, a paper trail that required someone with forensic accounting experience to interpret clearly. Daniel Park had written a 3-page summary that was careful not to overstate what the numbers showed, because overstatement would give Damon's attorneys something to attack. But the trust documents were not a gap. Those were iron. The board could not approve this acquisition without Elliot's authorization. That was written in language so plain that even someone who never read contracts would understand it once it was placed in front of them. And nobody, not Mara, not Damon, not the Callaway Group's team of attorneys who had apparently reviewed the deal structure, had caught it. Or if someone had caught it, they had chosen not to mention it. Elliot thought about that while he drank his coffee. Damon had called the trust documents buried in that misdirected text. But buried didn't mean non-existent. It meant deliberately not surfaced. It meant someone had looked at the company's ownership structure and decided that Elliot's position within it was inconvenient information and had chosen to proceed as though inconvenient information, if ignored long enough, would stop being true. That was not how it worked. Marcus came downstairs at 6, still in his undershirt, and stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw Elliot already dressed. "You're not going in like that," Marcus said. "Like what?" "Like a man who slept on a guest mattress that's 8 years old and had half a cup of coffee." He looked at Elliot carefully. "You need to look like you own something, because you do." Elliot looked down at the suit he'd chosen. It was a good suit, charcoal wool, well-fitted, the one he wore for quarterly presentations with major vendors. He had brought it in one of the boxes from the porch. "I look fine," he said. "You look tired and you look defensive," Marcus said, with the bluntness that only worked between brothers. "Stand up straight and stop holding your coffee like it owes you money." Elliot stood up straighter. Marcus was not wrong, and being told an uncomfortable truth at 6 in the morning by your older brother was, in its own way, a clarifying experience. "The meeting is at 10, Elliot said. "Then you have time to eat something." Marcus opened the refrigerator. "Sit down. I'm done." Sandra met him in the lobby of the Vance Apparel building at 9:15. She was a compact woman in her late 50s who wore glasses she rarely needed but kept on because they made her look less approachable, which she considered professionally useful. She had a leather portfolio under her arm and the expression of someone who had read the same documents enough times that she was no longer thinking about what they said, but about how to deploy them. "Daniel will be in the room," she told Elliot as they walked toward the elevators. "He's already upstairs. We have his summary prepared in hard copy for each board member." "How many copies?" "7 for the board, 3 extras, 1 for whoever's taking notes." She glanced at him. "Have you spoken to Mara?" "No?" "Good. Don't before the meeting, not even in the hallway." The lobby felt different than it normally did. It was the same atrium, the same brushed concrete and the framed photographs of the company's earliest collections lining the walls, the same reception desk where Patricia was already at her station with her butterscotch candies. But it felt like walking into a place he had not been invited, which was a strange sensation in a building whose financing he had arranged, whose operational structure he had designed, and whose original lease he had signed. Patricia looked up when he came in, and her expression shifted through 3 things in quick succession: surprise, something like relief, and then careful neutrality. "Good morning, Mr. Vance," she said. "Good morning, Patricia." He paused at the desk. "How's the butterscotch supply?" She almost smiled. "Adequate, sir?" He took the elevator to the 14th floor. The glass-walled conference room was visible from the elevator bank, and Elliot stopped when he saw it. The room was already half-populated. He recognized 3 of the board members. Vincent Rao, who had joined the board 4 years ago from a retail investment background. Claudia Mercer, the board's longest-serving independent director, who was 71 and had the energy of someone substantially younger and the patience of someone who had seen every kind of corporate maneuver twice. And James Whitmore, the newest member, who Damon had recommended for the position 8 months ago. Damon was in the room. He was standing near the window with his back partially to the door, talking to someone on his phone with the contained energy of a man managing several things at once. He was wearing a suit that was slightly better than the occasion required, which was, Elliot thought, the kind of detail you noticed when you knew what to look for. Mara was not in the room yet. Elliot walked to the small kitchen area near the conference room, poured himself a cup of water he didn't need, and waited. Sandra materialized beside him. "Cross just noticed you," she said quietly. "I know." He stopped talking. "I know that too." Elliot kept his eyes on the water in his cup. "Is Daniel set up?" "He's at the end of the table with the documents and folders. He'll wait for your signal." "What's the signal?" "When I put my portfolio on the table," she said. "He'll know." Elliot nodded. He drank the water he didn't need and set the cup down and looked up at the glass wall of the conference room, where Damon Cross had ended his phone call and was now watching him with an expression that was working very hard to appear relaxed and mostly failing. Elliot met his eyes. Damon looked away first. Mara arrived at 9:52. She came off the elevator with Eleanor at her side and a woman Elliot didn't recognize carrying a tablet and walking 2 steps behind. Some kind of executive assistant, new enough that Elliot hadn't met her. Mara was wearing a burgundy blazer over a cream blouse, and her hair was done in the way she wore it for formal presentations, pinned back on one side with a small piece of silver jewelry Elliot had given her for their 10th anniversary. He had forgotten about that piece of jewelry until this moment. The specificity of it was unexpectedly difficult. She saw him when she was 6 feet from the conference room door. Her stride didn't break. He gave her that. But something shifted in her face. Not guilt exactly. Not surprise, quite. Something in between that she covered quickly with the particular composure she had developed over years of walking into rooms where people underestimated her and proving them wrong. "Elliot," she said. Her voice was level. "Mara." Eleanor beside her said nothing. She looked at Elliot with an expression he could not immediately categorize, then looked away toward the conference room window. "You weren't on the attendee list," Mara said. "I'm aware of that. This is a board meeting, not a—" "I'm the authorized decision-maker for the Vance Legacy Trust," Elliot said. "I have a right to be present for any vote related to ownership transfer or acquisition. That's in the shareholder agreement. Article 9, Section 4. He paused. "You can verify that with your attorney if you'd like." The words landed differently than he expected. Her expression shifted again, something crossing it quickly, some question she hadn't fully formed yet. And then Damon was there, appearing at the conference room door with his jacket buttoned and his hand extended toward Elliot with the practiced ease of a man who had spent years deploying handshakes as tools of territory. "Elliot," Damon said, "glad you could make it." He said it the way people say things they do not mean, smoothly and without hesitation, which told Elliot that Damon had prepared for this possibility and had decided the best posture was confidence. That was useful information. Elliot did not take the offered hand. He simply looked at it for a moment and then looked back up at Damon's face. "Damon," he said. There was a beat of silence that was not quite comfortable. Damon lowered his hand. "We should get started," Mara said. "We have investors joining by video at 10. The conference table seated 12. Elliot took a chair on the left side near Sandra, with Daniel Park 2 seats down. The board members filed in and settled. Mara sat at the head of the table. Eleanor sat in one of the chairs along the wall, not at the table itself, which was technically the appropriate position for a non-board observer, a detail Elliot noted without comment. Damon sat across from Elliot. 3 seats down but direct line of sight, which may have been coincidence and almost certainly wasn't. At 10 o'clock exactly, 2 video screens on the far wall came to life with the faces of representatives from the Callaway Group. A senior partner named Harrison Briggs, who had the compact, careful look of someone who spent his professional life managing risk, and 2 other men whose names Elliot didn't catch and whose roles were apparently secondary. Mara opened the meeting. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. And watching her navigate the opening formalities was a reminder that what she had built as the public face of Vance Apparel was not performance. She was genuinely at ease in front of people in ways that Elliot had never been, and she had earned every bit of that ease through years of walking into rooms that hadn't been ready for her. She presented the acquisition framework for 12 minutes. Revenue figures, growth projections, strategic rationale, the Callaway Group's investment thesis for the brand. She didn't look at Elliot while she spoke, which was a choice, and she didn't make an error in the numbers, which was not a surprise. Whatever else had happened, Mara knew this company. Then she reached the closing section. "The final approval vote," she said, "will authorize the board to execute the definitive agreement with the Callaway Group, transferring 51% of Vance Apparel's outstanding equity in exchange for—" "I need to pause you there," said Claudia Mercer. The room shifted. Claudia had a way of speaking that stopped conversations without raising her voice. Decades of board work had given her that quality, the ability to command a room through the simple act of choosing to speak. Mara looked at her. "Claudia." "Before we proceed to a vote," Claudia said, "I'd like to address a question that was raised with me this morning." She looked down at a sheet of paper in front of her. Specifically, a question about the authorization requirements in the Vance Legacy Trust documents and their relationship to this transaction. The room was very quiet. Mara looked at Elliot. Elliot looked back at her without moving. "I've reviewed the shareholder agreement," Claudia continued, "and I've also reviewed the trust documents, which were provided to me this morning by Sandra Hewitt, who is present as counsel for the trust's authorized decision-maker." She nodded toward Sandra. "These documents establish clearly that any acquisition of controlling interest in Vance Apparel requires written authorization from the trust's designated officer, which is—" She looked at the paper. "Elliot Vance." Harrison Briggs, on the video screen, leaned forward. Mara had gone still in her chair. Not rigid, still. The way someone goes still when they're processing something unexpected and doing it very quickly and very privately. "What does that mean for the timeline?" Briggs asked. "It means," Sandra said, speaking for the first time, "that the transaction cannot be authorized today. And it means there are additional matters this board needs to address before any vote can take place." She placed her leather portfolio on the table. At the end of the table, Daniel Park began distributing folders. What followed was not dramatic in the way of television. There was no shouting. Nobody threw anything. People mostly sat very still while difficult things were said, which is how it actually goes when the difficult things are serious. Daniel walked through the vendor analysis in 11 minutes, methodically and without editorializing. He put numbers on the screen. He showed the timeline. He showed the acceleration. He showed the connection between the vendor entities and the business registrations and the family name that appeared alongside Damon Cross's in the public record. Damon said, "At minute 4, this is speculative." "It's documented," Daniel said without looking up from his notes. "Page 3 of your packet shows the payment records. Page 5 shows the registration trail. I'm happy to slow down if you'd like to follow along." At minute 8, James Whitmore, who Damon had recommended for the board 8 months ago, pushed his folder away from him and looked at the ceiling. At minute 11, Claudia said, "Is there more?" Sandra put the misdirected text on the screen. "Trust docs are buried. She never reads anything. We're clear." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Heavier. More specific. Mara read it. Elliot watched her read it. He watched her read it twice, which was how he knew she understood it. Not the sentence about the money, but the other sentence. She never reads anything. He watched something move through her face that was not anger yet, and was not grief yet, but was some raw material that would become both of those things later, in private, away from this room and these people. "Where did this come from?" Damon said. His voice was still controlled, but the control was effortful now. "A misdirected message," Sandra said, "sent to a contact who retained it." "That's inadmissible. This isn't a courtroom," Claudia said flatly. "We're a board, not a jury, and what we're looking at is grounds for suspension pending a full audit." She looked at Mara. "Do you want to address the board, Mara?" Mara had not looked away from the projected text. "Mara," Claudia said again, more gently. Mara blinked. She straightened in her chair. She looked at the board members in sequence, the way she always did when she was composing herself. A physical habit, left to right, methodical. "I'd like to call a recess," she said. Her voice was steady. It cost her something to make it steady, and Elliot could see that it cost her something, but she made it steady anyway. 20 minutes. 15, Claudia said. "There are people on the video call." 15, Mara agreed. She stood, and the room stood with her in the instinctive way it always did, and she walked out of the conference room without looking at Damon, and without looking at Elliot, and without looking at her mother, who was sitting against the wall with her hands folded in her lap, and her face showing the concentrated neutrality of someone who is deciding what they know and what they don't. Elliot walked to the window during the recess. The Atlanta skyline was clear today. The rain from 2 days ago had scrubbed the air clean, and the building stood sharp and bright against an October sky that had no ambivalence in it whatsoever. He heard footsteps behind him. He expected Damon, who would make one more attempt at some version of control, or Sandra, who had questions. It was neither. It was Nora. She had come in during the meeting's early minutes and taken a seat along the wall, and he hadn't acknowledged her because acknowledging her would have drawn Mara's attention, and there had been enough for Mara to process in that room already. Now Nora stood beside him at the window and looked out at the city and didn't say anything for a moment. She looked like her sister in some ways. The same bone structure, the same way of holding her shoulders, and nothing like her in others. She was quieter than Mara in everything, quieter and more careful, the kind of person who kept notes and said less than she knew and waited. "She read the text," Nora said. "Yes." "She understood it." "She will," Elliot said. "Maybe not today, but she will." Nora looked at him sideways. "Are you okay?" He thought about the question honestly. "I don't know yet." Fair answer. They stood at the window for another moment. "Didn't know about the trust," Nora said. It wasn't a question. She knew it existed. She didn't know what it meant. Elliot looked at the skyline. "That's on both of us, honestly. I set it up and I told her about it, and I didn't make sure she understood it. I thought she trusted me enough that the details didn't matter." He paused. "And she thought she knew the company well enough that the details didn't matter. So you were both wrong about the same thing in opposite directions." "More or less." "That's very Mara and Elliot," Nora said, and there was no bitterness in it, just the specific exhaustion of someone who had been watching two people miscommunicate for a long time. Across the room, Damon was in a corner with his phone pressed to his ear. His posture had changed, the ease was gone. He was standing the way people stand when options are narrowing, still upright, but differently, with the particular quality of attention of someone who is calculating rather than simply moving through a space he controls. He looked up and found Elliot watching him. This time, he held the eye contact. Then his phone call ended, and he put the phone in his pocket and walked toward them with the last of his composure around him like something he'd decided to wear until he absolutely couldn't. "I'd like a word," he said to Elliot. "This isn't the time for—" Nora started. "It's fine," Elliot said. Nora looked at him. Then she moved away, not out of earshot, but enough to give the appearance of privacy. Damon stood in front of Elliot and dropped the volume of his voice. "You don't understand what you've done," he said. "I think I do. That company needs this deal. Without the Callaway acquisition, the expansion stalls. 3 new markets, gone. The distribution infrastructure that Mara has been building for 2 years, it needs capital. The company has capital, Elliot said. It has capital that wasn't diverted through your family's holding companies. Damon's jaw tightened. What you found is explainable, he said. Then explain it to the investigators, Elliot said. I'm sure they'll be interested. Elliot, Damon's voice dropped further. There doesn't need to be investigators. We can structure this differently. The trust gives you leverage. Use it. You could still be part of this deal. Better terms for your position? Better. I'm going to stop you there, Elliot said quietly. He wasn't angry, or rather, the anger was present, but it was underneath the calm, and the calm was genuine. You told someone that Mara never reads anything. You built a plan around her not reading things. And you told someone that the trust documents were buried, and you built a plan around that too. He looked at Damon steadily. I spent 16 years being invisible in this company, being the person who handled things nobody wanted to think about. You thought that meant I wasn't paying attention. I want you to understand that those are not the same thing. Damon looked at him for a long moment. Then he stepped back. You're making a mistake, he said. I've made plenty, Elliot said. This isn't one of them. So, when the recess ended and the board reconvened, Mara came back into the room and sat at the head of the table with her hands folded in front of her, and looked at the board members one by one again, left to right, methodical. Then she looked at Harrison Briggs on the video screen. I need to request a postponement of the vote, she said, pending a full internal audit. Briggs absorbed this. He was a careful man, and he did not react quickly. That would push the closing window. Yes. The Callaway Group's offer has a 90-day expiration. I understand. If the audit takes longer, then the deal expires and we discuss it again with clean books, Mara said. Her voice had the particular flatness of someone who has just made a difficult decision and does not want it to be made more difficult by being talked out of it. This company has my name on it, both of our names on it. She didn't look at Elliot when she said it, but something in her posture acknowledged him. I'm not closing this transaction with open questions on the financials. Briggs looked off screen briefly, consulting someone. Then he looked back. We'll hold the window, out of respect for what's been built here. Thank you, Mara said. She turned to the board. Damon Cross is suspended from all executive functions effective immediately, pending the audit. Vivian Cole will serve as acting operational lead. She looked at Claudia. I'd like the board to formalize that. Claudia said, moved. Vincent Rao said, seconded. James Whitmore, who had pushed his folder away and looked at the ceiling 20 minutes ago, said, aye. The vote was unanimous. Damon did not speak. He sat at the table for a moment after the vote with his hands flat on the surface, and then he stood and picked up his jacket from the back of his chair and walked out. Nobody stopped him. There was nothing to stop him from leaving a room, and the people who needed to stop him from leaving other things, the city, the state, his accounts, would be in contact with him by the end of the day. Eleanor, sitting against the wall, watched her son-in-law's empty chair for a long moment. Then she looked at her hands. Elliot watched her look at her hands and thought about the kitchen renovation and the new car and the word Nora had used, arrangement, and decided that Eleanor's accounting would come in time and did not need his help to arrive. The board members began to gather their folders and their conversations. The video screens went dark. The room, which had been holding its breath for the better part of an hour, released it slowly, the way rooms do when the thing that needed to happen has happened, and what's left is just the aftermath, which is its own kind of work. Elliot sat at the table after most people had left and looked at the framed print on the conference room wall, a photograph of the Auburn Avenue storefront from the first year, two people in the window arranging a display, small and slightly blurry and full of some energy that the camera had caught without quite being able to explain. He remembered the day that photograph was taken. He remembered exactly how much money they had in the account that day because he had checked it that morning. He remembered what they had argued about on the drive there, something about the display font on the window lettering, and he remembered that Mara had been right about that too. He sat with those memories for a minute. Then he picked up his notepad and his laptop and he stood up and he walked out of the room into whatever came next. The afternoon after the board meeting had a particular quality that Elliot recognized from other difficult days in his life, a kind of suspended stillness, where the thing that needed to happen had happened, and the world hadn't yet caught up to the fact that everything was different now. He drove back to Marcus's house on autopilot, taking the same route he'd taken 2 nights ago in the rain, and the city looked exactly the same as it always did, which seemed wrong somehow. Streets that, indifferent to consequence, always struck him as faintly surreal. Marcus was at his office. Elliot let himself in with the spare key and sat at the kitchen table and did not open his laptop for the first time in 3 days. He sat there for a while. He wasn't thinking about Damon, or the board, or the vendors, or the numbers Daniel Park had laid out with such meticulous patience. He was thinking about a Sunday morning 8 years ago when he and Mara had driven out to Lake Lanier with no particular plan, just two people who hadn't had an unscheduled day in months. And Mara had fallen asleep in the passenger seat before they even reached the highway, and he had driven the whole way without the radio on, listening to her breathe, feeling, what? Content wasn't the right word. Something quieter than content. The sense of being exactly where you were supposed to be, which is a feeling so rare that most people don't have a name for it and don't recognize it until it's gone. He didn't know when that feeling had left. That was the honest part. It hadn't left on a specific day. It had gone the way things go when nobody is paying attention, gradually, incrementally, in small losses that each seemed manageable until you added them all up and found that the sum was enormous. His phone buzzed. Sandra. Authorities have been contacted Cross. Expect a busy few days. You don't need to be available to anyone except me. Rest if you can. He put the phone down and looked at the kitchen window and decided that rest was not currently an option, but that he could at least stop moving for an hour, which was a different thing. He managed 40 minutes before Marcus came home. Marcus came through the door with takeout from the Thai place on Commerce, and the expression of a man who had been thinking about his brother all day and had decided that the most useful thing he could do was bring food and not ask too many questions. He put the containers on the table. He got 2 forks. He sat down. Eat, he said. Elliot ate. The food was better than he deserved, which was a thought that didn't make complete sense but felt accurate anyway. How'd it go? Marcus asked after a few minutes. Damon's suspended. Board voted for an audit. The acquisition is postponed. Marcus absorbed this. And Mara? She called for the audit herself. She postponed the vote. So she did the right thing. Eventually, Elliot said, and then because that was ungenerous and also slightly unfair. Yes, she did the right thing. And you? I'm eating Thai food in your kitchen at 4 in the afternoon. That's not what I asked. Elliot set his fork down. I don't know what I am yet, Marcus. I know what I did today. I know it was the right thing. I know that Damon was going to take that money and disappear, and Mara would have been left holding a company that had been systematically hollowed out while she wasn't looking. He paused. I know all of that. I don't know what it means for the other part. The marriage part. The marriage part. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He poked at his container with his fork in the way he did when he was thinking something he wasn't sure how to say. She had the locks changed, he said finally. Yes. Before any of this. Before she knew about Damon. She just... He stopped. She made a decision about you, independent of all this. Yes. That doesn't disappear because Damon turned out to be a criminal. No, Elliot said. It doesn't. They ate in silence for a while. Outside, a car passed on the street. Somewhere in the neighborhood, someone was mowing a lawn at an hour that seemed late for it. What do you want? Marcus asked. It was the most direct question anyone had asked him in days, and it was strange that it should be the hardest one. He'd had lawyers and board members and forensic accountants asking him questions for 48 hours. None of them had asked him that. I want to understand what happened, Elliot said. Not the Damon part. I understand that part. The other part? When she stopped. When she started believing a version of the company's history that didn't include me. He looked at his food. I want to understand that. Have you asked her? Not yet. Are you going to? He picked up his fork again. I think I have to, he said. Not for the marriage. I don't know about the marriage. But for myself. I need to understand what I missed. Marcus nodded slowly. Then he said quietly, You didn't miss everything, Elliot. You caught it. 2 days before it closed, Elliot said. Still caught it, Marcus said. What? 3 days passed before Mara called. In those 3 days, a great deal happened that Elliot was peripherally aware of but not directly involved in. The audit team that Mara's board engaged, an outside firm with no prior relationship to Vance Apparel, arrived on Monday morning and began working through the company's financials with the systematic thoroughness of people who had done this before and knew where to look. Daniel Park had agreed to serve as a liaison, which Sandra had arranged, and Gerald from IT had provided full access to the system logs that showed every change to permissions and vendor records going back 18 months. Investigators from the state's Financial Crimes Unit made contact with Damon Cross on Saturday. Elliot learned this from Sandra, who had heard it from the attorney Nora had quietly retained for herself after the board meeting, because Nora understood, with her accountant's instincts, that the weeks ahead were going to require everyone to have their own representation. Eleanor Whitfield hired an attorney on Sunday. That was the thing that told Elliot the picture was larger than he'd confirmed. Innocent people who had made no relevant financial decisions did not, in his experience, hire attorneys on Sunday afternoons. He spent those 3 days at Marcus's house, working remotely on the financing matters that had always been his responsibility and that continued to be his responsibility regardless of anything else. He took calls with vendors who had heard rumors. The fashion industry was not large, and its information networks were faster than most people assumed, and he gave the same answer to each of them. The company was undergoing a routine audit. Operations were continuing normally. Their contracts were unaffected. He said it in the same calm, even tone each time, and by the third day he had said it enough times that it had stopped feeling like performance and started feeling like the plain truth, which it largely was. Vivian Cole called him on Tuesday. Vivian was the CFO, had been the CFO for 6 years, a careful and meticulous woman from Chicago who had come up through retail finance and had the specific quality of someone who had never confused a balance sheet with a story about a balance sheet. She and Elliot had always worked well together, in the way that people who share a fundamental approach to numbers and risk tend to work well together, without drama and without the need to establish territory. "I wanted to check in," she said when he picked up. "Not officially, just to check in. How's it going over there?" "Strangely," she said. "It's strange being in charge of a building where I was in charge of everything except being in charge, if that makes sense." "It makes complete sense. The audit team is good. They're finding things." She paused. "More than 6 million is the current confirmed number, but they're still working." "I expected more," Elliot said. "So did I," Vivian said, "which means the final number will probably be more." He didn't ask her what Mara was doing, and Vivian didn't offer it. They talked for 20 minutes about the operational situation, the vendor relationships that needed attention, the quarterly numbers that were still due regardless of anything else. When they finished, Vivian said, "You should know that most of the staff are glad you were there Thursday." He didn't know what to say to that exactly. "Thank you, Vivian," he said. "Don't thank me. I'm stating a fact." She paused. "Take care of yourself, Elliot." Mara called on Wednesday evening at 7:14. He was sitting on Marcus's back porch watching it get dark, which was something he had been doing most evenings because there was something about the specific transition from late afternoon to early night that felt like the only honest part of the day. The light didn't pretend, it just changed. He looked at the name on his phone for a moment. He answered. "Hi," she said. "Hi." A pause. Not uncomfortable. Or not only uncomfortable. More like both of them understanding that whatever words came next would matter, and neither of them wanting to use the wrong ones. "How are you?" Mara asked. "Okay," he said. "You?" "Honestly?" A small exhale. "I don't know what I am right now. I've been trying to find the right word for 3 days and I can't." "I know that feeling," he said. Another pause. "I want to talk," she said. "In person. Not about the legal stuff. Sandra's office can handle that. I mean..." She stopped. He heard her move, a chair shifting, the small sounds of a house he knew. "I mean, the other kind of talking." "Okay," he said. "Tomorrow? There's a place on Peachtree I like. Public but quiet. A coffee place." "I know the one," he said. He did. She'd mentioned it before. A small independent place she went to when she needed to think without being recognized. "What time?" 10? 10 works." She was quiet for a moment. Elliot, she said. I'm not calling because of the trust or the acquisition. I want you to know that. I know, he said. Do you? Yes, he said, and he meant it. He got there at 9:55, which was a habit. He had always arrived early to every meeting, every appointment, every occasion that mattered. It was the kind of thing Mara had teased him about in the early years, arriving early to their own dinner parties and straightening coasters that nobody would look at. The coffee place was narrow and warm and smelled of roasted beans and something baking in the back. He ordered a black coffee and sat at a table near the window, and at 10:02 Mara came through the door. She looked tired. Not the polished, managed fatigue of someone who had slept enough but had a hard week, actually tired, the kind that lives behind the eyes and doesn't respond to concealer. She was wearing a dark green jacket he didn't recognize, and her hair was loose, which was unusual for her during the week. She ordered something at the counter and then came and sat across from him and put her bag on the chair beside her and looked at him. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course," he said. She wrapped her hands around her cup. She looked at the table for a moment, and he let her, because he had learned over 16 years that Mara organized her thoughts the way she organized a room. She needed to move things around before she started talking, and interrupting that process only made it take longer. "I've been trying to figure out where to start," she said finally. "Start wherever it makes sense," he said. That's the problem." She looked up at him. "None of it makes sense, or it makes too much sense, and I don't like the story it's telling." She paused. "Did you know? About Damon?" "Not everything, not the fraud specifically. I suspected the vendors were connected to him. I suspected the acquisition was moving too fast, and in a direction that didn't benefit the company structurally, and I suspected—" He stopped. "What?" "That there was something personal," he said, "between you two. I didn't know. I suspected." She nodded slowly. She didn't confirm or deny it directly, and he didn't push because he had decided, somewhere in the last 3 days, that the personal dimensions of Damon Cross were Mara's to process on her own timeline, and not his to demand an accounting of. "He told me," she said carefully, "that you were a liability, that your involvement in the company's structure was making the acquisition complicated, that the investors were nervous about—" She stopped again. Her jaw tightened briefly. He had a whole language for it, a whole framework, and I listened to it. "For how long?" "A year, maybe more." She looked at her cup. He started slowly. He didn't say negative things about you at first. He just framed things differently. Your role, your contributions. Made them sound smaller. Made the operational stuff sound like administration, like maintenance work, not the foundation. She paused. "And I let him. I let him because I wanted—" She stopped. "What did you want?" She looked at him directly, and her eyes were tired and honest in a way that he hadn't seen in a long time. "I wanted to have built this myself," she said. "That's the ugly part. I wanted the story to be simpler. I came up with the vision, I built the brand, I drove the growth. And you were important, but I did the essential part." She said it quietly and without self-justification, in the way of someone confessing something they've known for a while and haven't been able to say out loud. "He gave me permission to tell that story, and I took it." Elliot held his cup in both hands and looked at her and didn't say anything for a moment. "Mara," he said finally. "I know," she said. "You did build it. That's the thing. You built the brand. You built the relationships. You walked into rooms and made people believe in something that didn't exist yet. That's not a small thing. That's the thing. The reason the company has value is because of what you built." "But not only that," she said. "No, not only that." She nodded. Her eyes were bright, but she didn't look away. "The contract," she said. "The acquisition contract. I signed it without reading it. I knew there were trust provisions in the company's structure. I was there when you set it up. She exhaled. "I didn't think it applied to this. Or I didn't think about whether it applied. Damon said the structure was straightforward, and I believed him because it was easier to believe him than to read 100 pages of documents." "Sandra told me you were present for the trust documentation," Elliot said. "All of it." "I was present," Mara said. "I wasn't reading." She gave a short, unhappy sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I never read anything. He was right about that part." "He used it against you." "He used it against me," she agreed, "and I handed it to him." They sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, Peachtree Street went about its business. People walking, a delivery truck double parked, a woman pushing a stroller with the focused efficiency of someone running 10 minutes behind. "My mother," Mara said. "You don't have to—" "She took money from him," Mara said. "From Damon, or through him. Through some arrangement with one of those vendors. I don't know the exact structure yet. The auditors are finding it." Her voice was level, but her hands tightened on the cup. "She told me it was an investment, that she'd made some good investments. She let me believe that." Elliot thought about Eleanor sitting against the wall in the conference room, watching Damon's empty chair. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be sorry for me," she said, with a flash of the old sharpness. Then more quietly, "Be sorry for my mother. She's going to have to figure out who she is on the other side of this, and that's going to be harder for her than it is for me." He wasn't sure he agreed with that assessment, but he didn't argue it. "What about Nora?" he asked. Mara looked at her cup. This was the harder one, he could tell. Harder than Damon, harder than Eleanor, harder maybe than Elliot himself. "She tried to tell me," Mara said. "I know. 3 weeks ago, she came to me and I told her—" She stopped. "I told her she was jealous. That she'd always been jealous." She shook her head. "Nora has never been jealous of anything in her life. She watches and she waits. And when she says something, it's because she's thought about it for a long time. I know that about her. I've known that about her since she was 8 years old." She looked up. "And I told her she was jealous." "She stayed," Elliot said. "She came to me. She came to the board meeting." "She did." Mara's voice was careful. "I don't know how to—" She stopped. "I don't know what to do with that. With someone who does the right thing after you've told them they have the wrong motive." "You say thank you," Elliot said. "Eventually, when you're ready. She'll wait." "How do you know she'll wait?" "Because she already waited longer than she should have," he said. "And she still showed up." Mara looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read. Then she nodded, slowly, as if agreeing to something she hadn't yet put into words. They were quiet for a while. The coffee place filled up slightly. 2 women at the counter, a man with headphones and a laptop settling in the corner. The ordinary friction of a Wednesday morning going on around the edges of their conversation. "Elliot," she said, "what do you want?" "From this?" "From—" She gestured vaguely, meaning the company, the situation, the fact of their continued existence in each other's lives despite everything. "What do you actually want?" He thought about Marcus asking him the same question 3 nights ago at the kitchen table. "From the company," he said, "I want the audit to finish and the books to be clean, and whoever did what they did to face the appropriate consequences. I want the Callaway acquisition reconsidered on its actual merits, if there are any, without Damon managing the narrative." "And personally?" He looked at her. She was watching him steadily, with the same direct quality she'd always had, the quality that had first caught his attention years ago. She looked at things the way they were, even when it was uncomfortable, or she had, before the last year. "I want to understand what happened to us," he said. "Not for any particular outcome. I'm not saying that to protect myself. I genuinely mean it. I think somewhere in the last few years, before Damon, before any of this, we stopped talking about real things, and I'd like to understand when that happened and why." "That's a very Elliot answer," she said. "What does that mean?" "It means you want to understand the mechanism, the how and the why. As if understanding it fixes it. Understanding it doesn't fix it," he said. "But I can't make any decisions about what I want going forward until I understand where we actually are, and where we actually got to." He paused. "Can you?" She was quiet for a long moment. "No," she said. "I can't." "Then that's what I want, that conversation, however long it takes." She nodded. She picked up her cup and drank the last of whatever she'd ordered and set it down and looked at the table for a moment. "I told the board this morning that I'm stepping back from the CEO role during the audit period," she said, "voluntarily, before they asked me to." He hadn't expected that. "Mara, it's the right thing," she said, with a firmness that closed that particular door. "I signed a contract without reading it. I appointed a COO who was defrauding the company. I changed a legal framework without understanding what was in it. Those are my failures, Elliot, not yours, not the board's." She looked at him. "I can't lead a company through an audit of my own decisions." That's not humility. It's just math. He looked at her for a moment. Who will lead it? He asked. Vivian, she said. I recommended her this morning. The board agreed. A small pause. She's better than both of us at this point, honestly. She kept the books clean when everyone around her was... She stopped. She protected the company when I wasn't. There was something in how she said it that sat with him. Not guilt, exactly, but the weight of clarity. The particular heaviness of seeing something plainly for the first time after a long period of choosing not to look. You protected it too, he said. Today, stepping back. Don't give me credit for doing what I should have done, she said, and there was an edge in it that was not anger but was close to it, directed inward. He didn't push. Outside, the delivery truck had moved on, and the woman with the stroller was gone, and Peachtree Street had rearranged itself into its afternoon configuration, indifferent as always. I have to ask you something, he said. She looked at him. The night you had the locks changed, he said, before you called the locksmith. Did you know about Damon? About the vendors? About any of it? No, she said immediately. Then why? Because I was angry, she said. I had been angry for a long time, and I had been building that anger on a story that Damon fed me, and I decided to do it before I lost the nerve. She paused. I thought you had been holding me back. I thought the company was mine, and the structure you'd built around it was a kind of control. That's what I thought. She met his eyes. I was wrong. About the motive. About the story. I was wrong. She said it plainly, without performance, the way she said the few things in her life that she said from the bottom. He nodded. I know, he said. They parted on the sidewalk outside the coffee place with the practical awkwardness of two people whose lives are still enormously entangled despite their best attempts to be adults about it. She was going back to the house on Whitmore Lane. It was still her house, legally, and that question had not been settled and would require its own conversations with its own attorneys in its own time. He was going back to Marcus's guest room with the clicking ceiling fan. They did not hug. They were past a handshake and not at a hug, which was its own kind of landmark in the geography of a marriage falling apart. She said she would call. He said he would pick up. He walked to his car and sat in it for a moment without starting the engine. He thought about what she had said, about building the story she wanted to be true, the simpler story, the one where her vision and her energy and her particular gift for walking into a room and making it believe in something were the whole of what the company was. He understood the appeal of that story. He had his own version of it, the version where he had quietly managed everything important and kept the company standing while she took the credit. He had been telling himself parts of that story too, in the margins of his resentment, which he was now honest enough to admit had been there. Two people telling themselves simplified versions of the same complicated truth, until someone came along who was willing to tell them both exactly what they wanted to hear. That was the mechanism. That was the how and the why he had wanted to understand. He started the car. The audit was running. The investigators were working. Damon Cross had an attorney and a timeline problem and a paper trail that Daniel Park had described, in his careful way, as extensive. Eleanor Whitfield had an attorney and a set of financial decisions she would eventually have to explain to people with the authority to ask. Nora was somewhere in the city, keeping notes, waiting with the patience of someone who had always understood that the right moment for certain truths was not the first available moment, but the necessary one. And Vivian Cole was sitting in the CEO office on the 14th floor of the Vance Apparel building, probably with 2 spreadsheets open and a third one she was building from scratch, doing what she had always done, protecting the books, maintaining the structure, keeping the reel from collapsing under the weight of the story people had decided to tell about it. Elliot pulled out of the parking space and drove north on Peachtree and thought, it wasn't over. None of it was over. The audit would take weeks. The legal process would take months. The personal questions, the ones that didn't have attorneys or investigators or forensic accountants, the ones that lived between two people who had spent 16 years building something together and had nearly lost it to a man who had counted on both of them not paying close enough attention, those questions would take whatever they took. But the thing that had needed to happen had happened. He had been in that room. He had not let them close the door. The audit took 6 weeks. Elliot knew this was fast, by the standards of corporate forensic work. Daniel Park told him so. In the matter-of-fact way he said most things, when they spoke on the phone at the end of the third week. For a company this size with this level of obfuscation in the vendor structure, 6 weeks is moving quickly, Daniel said. Which tells you the trail was there. It was just arranged to be inconvenient, not actually hidden. Inconvenient but not hidden. That phrase stayed with Elliot. It described a certain kind of arrogance. The assumption that inconvenience was enough, that nobody would bother to look closely enough for it to matter. Damon had built his scheme on the premise that the people around him were either too trusting or too distracted to follow the thread. He had been right about that premise for 14 months. He had miscalculated on the timeline. Elliot spent those 6 weeks in a state of controlled motion that didn't feel like calm but functioned like it. He moved out of Marcus's guest room at the end of the first week into a furnished apartment in Midtown that Sandra's office had helped him locate quickly. 2 bedrooms and a view of nothing in particular, and a kitchen that smelled faintly of the previous tenant's cooking, which was not unpleasant. He brought his boxes from the porch. Marcus had kept them in his garage, and unpacked what he needed and left the rest. He was not sure how long he would be there and didn't want to commit to the space more than the space required. He went back to the office in the second week. This was Vivian's suggestion, delivered in her direct way during one of their calls. "You have legitimate work to do here," she said. "The financing relationships are yours. The vendor contracts that aren't under investigation need attention. Come in." He had asked if Mara would be there. "She's coming in 2 days a week," Vivian said. "Mornings. You can work around that if you need to, or you can be adults about it. Either way." He went in on a Thursday, which was not one of Mara's days, and it was strange in the way he'd expected. Patricia at the desk with her butterscotch candies, the elevator that was slightly slow on the way up, the 14th floor with its glass conference room where 6 weeks ago everything had cracked open. Gerald from IT stopped him in the hallway and shook his hand with the grip of someone who had been waiting to do that and said simply, "Good to have you back, Mr. Vance," and moved on. Vivian had given him back full system access. His office was the same as he'd left it, which was either an oversight or a decision, and he chose not to ask which. He sat at his desk and opened his email and started working through the vendor relationships that had nothing to do with Damon's network and everything to do with keeping the company's supply chain from developing problems while everyone's attention was elsewhere. He made 11 calls that day. 9 of them were straightforward. 2 required more careful conversations about the company's current stability, and he had those conversations with the same honest steadiness he'd been using with everyone since the board meeting. Here is what is happening. Here is what is not happening. Your contract is unaffected. He was on the phone at 4:30 when Mara walked past his office door. He hadn't known she was coming in that day. She may not have known he'd be there. She slowed. He saw it through the glass, and then kept walking, and he kept talking to the distributor on the other end of the line, and neither of them acknowledged the other, which was not hostility, so much as the reasonable management of a situation that didn't have a clear protocol yet. He finished the call at 4:45 and sat in the quiet of his office and thought that the company was, in its fundamental way, still standing. Battered and exposed and under scrutiny, but standing. There was something in that. The audit's final report was delivered on a Tuesday in the 6th week. Sandra called him that afternoon with the summary. The confirmed amount diverted through Damon's vendor network was $8.3 million over 14 months. Not the $6 million Daniel had estimated, 8.3. The acceleration in the final quarter had been sharper than the early analysis suggested, consistent with someone preparing to move a final large sum before the acquisition closed, and provided sufficient noise to cover the transfer. 3 of the 5 vendor entities were directly connected to family members of Damon Cross. A 4th was connected to a business associate whose relationship with Damon predated his time at Vance Apparel by 7 years. The 5th was a legitimate supplier that had been used as a pass-through, its principals apparently unaware of the arrangement, a detail that would matter to investigators as they built the case. Eleanor Whitfield had received, through one of the vendor entities, payments totaling $260,000 over 8 months. Her attorney had been in contact with the investigators. She had agreed to cooperate and provide a full accounting of what she knew and when she knew it. The cooperation agreement, Sandra told Elliot, suggested that Eleanor's role had been less active architecture and more willful blindness. She had asked fewer questions than she should have about money that appeared in an account and told herself a story about investments that she may or may not have fully believed. "Will she be charged?" Elliot asked. "That's the investigator's call," Sandra said. "The cooperation agreement gives her some protection. What she does with it depends on how honest she's willing to be." Nora, when Elliot called to tell her the number, was quiet for a long moment. 260,000, she said. "Yes." "She had her kitchen redone for 40,000, Nora said. "That leaves—" "Nora, I didn't call to make you do the math." "I know." Another pause. "I'm going to go see her this weekend. My mother. We need to—" She stopped. "She's going to need someone who isn't an attorney to talk to." "She's lucky you're that person," Elliot said. "She's not lucky," Nora said, but without real heat. "She's family. That's different." Damon Cross was formally charged 7 weeks after the board meeting. The charges were multiple: fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and conspiracy. The forgery charge related to the medical document, the fabricated assessment suggesting Elliot was mentally incapacitated, which had been prepared by a contact of Damon's who held a professional license he would shortly be losing. This document had apparently been intended as a contingency, a way to challenge Elliot's authority under the trust if he had appeared at the board meeting and attempted to exercise it. It had never been deployed because Elliot had appeared and the situation had moved too fast for Damon's contingencies to catch up. When Elliot heard about the medical document, he sat with it for a long time. He had known, at some level, that Damon had planned for the possibility of his interference. The misdirected text, the access restrictions, the carefully cultivated narrative about his irrelevance, those were all preparation. But the medical document was something else. It was not just preparation. It was the particular kind of cruelty that comes from looking at a person and deciding that the most efficient way to remove them is to declare them not fully present in their own mind. He didn't tell Marcus about the medical document. He didn't tell Sandra, who already knew. He didn't tell anyone. He sat with it for an evening, and then he put it in a place in his mind where he kept things that had happened to him and couldn't be undone. And he went to bed. Some things you process out loud and some things you process in the dark by yourself, and part of getting older is knowing which is which. Hi and Mara had their second real conversation 6 weeks in, on a Saturday afternoon that neither of them had planned. He had come to the house on Whitmore Lane to collect the remaining boxes of his things, items that hadn't been on the porch that first night, books and files, and a collection of old vinyl records he'd been carrying from apartment to apartment since his 20s. He had texted ahead, as arranged. Mara had said she would be out. She wasn't out. She was in the kitchen when he let himself in with the key she'd left under the mat, sitting at the counter with a cup of tea and a legal pad covered in her handwriting, and she looked up when he came in with the particular expression of someone who was not entirely surprised by a thing they had nominally not expected. "I thought you had plans," he said. "They fell through," she said. "I should have texted. I'm sorry." "It's fine." He set down the box he'd carried in from the car. "I'll be quick." "You don't have to be quick," she said. "The records are in the living room. I moved them so you wouldn't have to dig." He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. "They were always yours," she said, simply. He went to the living room and found the records stacked neatly beside the bookcase, wrapped in paper bags from the grocery store to protect the sleeves, the way he'd always stored them. He stood there for a moment looking at them. Then he picked up the first stack and carried it to the car and came back for the second. And on the third trip, Mara was standing in the living room doorway with her tea. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure." "When you set up the trust, the Vance Legacy Trust, did you do it because you didn't trust me?" He stopped with a stack of records in his arms and looked at her. "No," he said. "I did it because I was afraid of losing everything we'd built. It had nothing to do with trust." "But you didn't tell me what it meant, what it actually protected." "No," he said. "I explained it and I moved on, because I thought the details were mine to handle and the vision was yours to handle, and that was how we worked." He paused. "I was wrong about that. I let us divide things in a way that left you without information you needed." She absorbed this. "I let you," she said. "I wanted you to handle it so I didn't have to." "Yes." "That was convenient for me," she said. "Until it wasn't." "Until it wasn't," he agreed. He carried the records to the car, and she followed him as far as the front porch and stood there with her tea while he loaded the trunk. The October air had gotten colder since the board meeting. It was proper fall now. The The trees on Whitmore Lane doing what they did in November, going gold and red and then bare. "The board is going to ask me to formalize my transition," she said when he closed the trunk. "Make the interim period official. Sign off on Vivian's appointment permanently." "Are you going to?" She looked at the tree in the front yard, a tall oak that had been there when they bought the house, older than both of them, indifferent to their particular history. "Yes," she said. "It's the right call. I know that." She looked at him. "I'm not sure I know what I do next. After that." "You'll figure it out," he said. "That's the one thing I've never doubted about you." She gave him a look that was not quite gratitude and not quite resistance, somewhere between the two, in the complicated territory where people land when they've been told something true by someone they've hurt. "Are you doing okay?" she asked. "Really? Really?" he said. "More or less. Some days more and some days less." "The apartment?" "It's fine. Serviceable." He looked at the house. "It doesn't have a ceiling fan that clicks." She almost smiled. "Marcus's guest room?" "It clicks every third rotation, all night." "I always told you the guest room mattress was bad," she said. "You did," he said. "You were right about that, too." The almost smile became an actual one, small and tired and real. She looked at the street for a moment and then back at him. "I'm going to see a therapist," she said. "I started last week. I'm not telling you that because I want credit. I'm telling you because I think you should know that I know I have things to work through that I can't work through alone." "That's good, Mara." "Don't say it like I've done something admirable." "I'm not," he said. "I'm saying it's good. There's a difference." She looked at him steadily. "Are you? Seeing someone?" "Yes." He wasn't. He had been thinking about it. "Not yet," he said. "I'm working up to it." "Don't take too long," she said. "Not a command, just Mara." He drove back to the Midtown apartment with the records in the trunk and the particular weight of that conversation settling into the afternoon. It was not a happy conversation, and it was not a resolved conversation, but it was an honest one, and honest conversations, he was learning, sometimes had to substitute for resolution when resolution wasn't ready yet. The thing about consequences was that they took time. Not metaphorical time, actual calendar time, weeks and months, during which people went about the business of their lives while investigators gathered documents and attorneys filed motions, and the wheels of institutional accountability turned at the speed they turned, which was never fast enough for the people waiting on them, and always faster than the people dreading them expected. Elliot watched this process from a particular vantage point, close enough to have standing in it, far enough to have some perspective on it. He went to the office 3 days a week. He maintained the vendor relationships and the financing structures and the operational details that had always been his domain. He met with Vivian regularly, and those meetings were practical and productive and occasionally, briefly, something warmer than professional. She was a person who showed her respect through competence, and working beside someone who showed their respect that way was, for Elliot, one of the more sustaining things in a season that had relatively few of them. He had dinner with Marcus every Thursday. Marcus asked fewer questions as the weeks went on, which was partly because Elliot was volunteering more, and partly because Marcus had always understood that the most useful thing he could do for his brother was remain consistently present and not make that presence contingent on any particular kind of conversation. He called Nora twice a week. Their conversations were practical on the surface: the audit findings, the legal process, the company's operational recovery. And underneath that, they were something else. The kind of conversation that happens between two people who have been through the same storm from different positions and are still making sense of what they saw. "How's your mother?" he asked on a Wednesday evening in the 7th week. "Smaller," Nora said, not unkindly. "She's always seemed very certain of herself. Since all this, she's smaller, more careful. She asks my opinion about things she never used to ask about." "Is that good?" "I don't know yet," Nora said. "It could be good. Or it could be someone who's just scared, performing humility. I can't tell yet." "Will you be able to tell?" "Eventually. Nora always figures it out eventually." She paused. "That's not arrogance. I've just known her my whole life." "I know," he said. Elliot, she said. "How are you and Mara?" "We're not Mara and Elliot anymore," he said, in the way that phrase usually means. "I know that," she said. "That's not what I asked." He thought about how to answer that. "We're figuring out what we are," he said. "We're not enemies. We're not strangers. He paused. "We built something together for a long time. You don't just become nothing to each other, but I don't know what the word is for what we are." "Maybe there isn't one yet," Nora said. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe we have to build that too." 8 weeks after the board meeting, Damon Cross was arraigned. Elliot didn't go to the courthouse. He had no reason to be there. He was not testifying at the arraignment, and showing up would have been about something other than the legal process, which he wasn't interested in. He read the news coverage online that evening, sitting in the Midtown apartment with a cup of coffee, and the coverage was thorough enough in the local business press. Former COO of Vance Apparel, multiple counts, substantial alleged financial harm. There was a photograph. Damon in a suit, which was a choice. Some attorneys advised clients to dress down for arraignments, to appear more ordinary and sympathetic. Others advised the opposite, to signal that nothing had changed and the client was confident of acquittal. The suit was good. The expression was controlled. Elliot looked at the photograph for a moment and then closed the browser. He thought about the last thing Damon had said to him in the corner of the conference room during the board meeting recess. "You're making a mistake," said with the conviction of a man who still believed that the world would bend to his version of it if he committed to it hard enough. There were people like that, people for whom confidence and preparation and a good enough story had always been sufficient, and who therefore assumed they would always be sufficient, and who were genuinely surprised when they weren't. It was not stupidity. Damon Cross was not stupid. It was a different kind of error. The error of mistaking a record of success for a guarantee of it. Elliot closed his laptop and sat in the apartment that smelled faintly of someone else's cooking and thought about what it meant to be 44 years old and starting over in a way he had not chosen and could not have predicted. He thought starting over was the wrong frame. He wasn't starting over. He was starting from somewhere, which was different. He had his work, his relationships, his understanding of what had happened and why, the hard-won clarity of someone who had been tested and had not looked away. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, considerably more than nothing, even if it didn't feel like a foundation yet. It would feel like a foundation. He was fairly sure of that. Not today, but eventually. The conversation that surprised him most happened in the 9th week, on a Tuesday morning, when Eleanor Whitfield came to his office. She hadn't called ahead. Patricia buzzed him and said, in a voice carefully stripped of editorial content, that Mrs. Whitfield was in the lobby asking if he had a few minutes. He said yes before he had time to decide whether yes was the right answer, which was probably how it should work. Eleanor was 71 and had the bearing of a woman who had spent most of her life in rooms where she was the most carefully dressed person present. She came into his office wearing a gray coat he didn't recognize and carrying a small bag, and sat in the chair across from his desk without waiting to be invited, which was very Eleanor. She looked older than she had at the board meeting. The focused neutrality she'd worn in that room had given way to something more unguarded, not defeated, but unprotected in a way she hadn't been before. "I'm not here about the legal situation," she said before he could speak. "Okay," he said. "My attorney handles that." She folded her hands in her lap. "I'm here because I've been thinking about what I should say to you, and I decided that waiting for the right moment meant it would never happen." He didn't say anything. He waited. "I didn't like you," she said, "when Mara first brought you home. I should tell you that plainly, because you probably already knew it, and pretending otherwise would be insulting to both of us." "I knew," he said. "I thought you were too quiet, too careful. I thought a man who was always thinking before he spoke was a man who was hiding something." She looked at her hands. "I understand now that I had that exactly backward." He looked at her steadily. "I let a man into my daughter's life," she said, "because he was loud enough and confident enough that I confused it for substance. And I accepted money from a situation I did not fully investigate because I wanted the things that money bought. And because I told myself a story about it that I knew, somewhere, was not quite true." She paused. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not owed your forgiveness." "Then what are you asking?" he said. "I'm not asking anything," she said. "I'm telling you that I was wrong about you, about the role you played in what was built, and I'm telling you because it needed to be said to you directly, not through attorneys or through Mara or through anyone else." He sat with that for a moment. Eleanor Whitfield had never, in 16 years, directly acknowledged him as essential to anything. She had tolerated him. She had occasionally been warm in the way of someone tolerating something graciously. She had listened to Damon Cross's story about him being a liability, and she had found it convenient enough to adopt. And now she was sitting in his office in a gray coat she hadn't worn before and telling him she had been wrong. He thought about Nora's word, smaller, and about the question of whether it was fear or something real. Looking at Eleanor, he thought it might be both. Fear can be the beginning of something real. That was not a comfortable thought, but it was probably a true one. "I appreciate you coming in," he said. "That took something." "It took considerably less than I owe," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but it's a start." She nodded once. She stood and picked up her bag and looked at him for a moment with the particular expression of someone who has said what they needed to say and is not sure what face to wear now that they've said it. "Mara is going to be all right," she said. "She's harder than she looks, my daughter. Always has been." "I know," Elliot said. "So is Nora." Something shifted in Eleanor's face at that. Not quite pain, but close to it. "Yes," she said quietly. "She is." She left. He listened to her footsteps in the hallway, and then the elevator, and then nothing. He sat at his desk and looked at the place she'd been sitting and thought about how strange it was that the people who hurt us were rarely the cartoons we needed them to be. Rarely only one thing, rarely without the capacity to surprise us. That didn't make the damage they'd done smaller, but it made the world more complicated, and Elliot had always found that complicated was, in the end, more honest than simple. The company's public statement about Damon Cross's departure and the audit was released at the end of October. Vivian had written it, or overseen its writing, and it was exactly what a statement of that kind should be: precise, unemotional, factual, without being inflammatory, conveying the essential information while protecting the company's interests and the ongoing legal process. Elliot read it twice and thought that Vivian was, as Mara had said, better than both of them at this particular point in the company's life. The statement mentioned the board's decision to appoint Vivian as CEO on a permanent basis. It mentioned the audit's completion. It did not mention Damon's name more than once. It did not mention Elliot at all, which was appropriate. His involvement in the situation was not a public matter, and his role going forward was the same as it had always been, structural and largely invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. He was at peace with that, more at peace than he might have expected. There was a call that came in the afternoon after the statement went public, from a reporter at the Atlanta Business Chronicle who had, through some combination of sources and inference, put together a partial version of what had happened and wanted to talk. Elliot declined and referred the call to the company's communications team. He had nothing to say publicly that wasn't already being said through the appropriate channels, and he had never been interested in the version of himself that existed in newspaper coverage. He ended that day at his desk at 6 in the evening, the office mostly quiet around him, working through a financing proposal for a distribution infrastructure project that Vivian had asked him to evaluate. The project was good, the fundamentals were solid, the timing was reasonable, and if the audit findings and the legal process landed where they were expected to, the company would be in a position to move on it in the first quarter. He finished his notes on the proposal and sent them to Vivian with a recommendation to proceed to the next stage. Then he sat back and looked at the framed photo on his desk. Not of Mara, which would have been too complicated, but of the original Auburn Avenue storefront, the same image that hung on the conference room wall. Two small figures in the window, full of something the camera had captured without understanding. He thought, something real happened there. Whatever came after, whatever got distorted and taken and broken, something real happened in that storefront, and it produced something that was still standing. That was not nothing. He turned off his desk lamp and picked up his coat and walked to the elevator and went home to the apartment that smelled of someone else's cooking. And the city at 6 in the evening did what it always did, indifferent and enormous, making room for whatever came next. Winter came to Atlanta the way it always did, not dramatically, not with the conviction of northern cities that committed fully to the season, but gradually and a little reluctantly, as if the city kept hoping fall would last a few more weeks. The temperatures dropped in November and the trees finished what they'd started in October, and the streets had that particular quality of bare-limbed afternoons where the light came through differently, cleaner and more honest, with nowhere left to hide. Elliot noticed the seasons more than he used to. That was one of the things that changed when you lived alone after a long time of not living alone. The small environmental shifts that a shared life tends to absorb into its larger noise became more present, more specific. He noticed the morning light in the Midtown apartment. He noticed the way the temperature dropped between 6 and 7 in the evening during November. He noticed that he had started, without planning to, buying groceries more carefully, smaller quantities, more frequently, the way a person shops when they are cooking only for themselves, and have stopped maintaining the fiction of the family-sized portion. I was not miserable. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He was in a period of significant adjustment, which was different from misery, and he had enough self-knowledge by now to recognize the difference. Miserable was not being able to get out of bed. Adjustment was getting out of bed and going through the day with the particular weight of a changed life on your back, and finding that the weight was manageable, and some days even finding that it clarified things. What it clarified mostly was what he actually valued, not in the abstract motivational way that phrase usually got used, but concretely, specifically. He valued his work, which was real work that required his full attention and produced visible results. He valued his brother's company, the Thursday dinners that had become the reliable rhythm of his week. He valued Nora, who had become something more like a friend than a sister-in-law in the months since the board meeting, which was an unexpected outcome of an unexpected situation and one of the few things in this period he was simply grateful for without complication. He had started seeing a therapist in November, a man named Walter, who worked out of an office in Buckhead and had the quality Elliot most appreciated in people he needed to trust. He listened more than he spoke, and when he spoke he said things that were true rather than things that were comforting, which meant the comfort, when it came, was earned. "You keep describing yourself in terms of the company," Walter said in the fourth session. "I worked there for 16 years, Elliot said. "You built it, that's what you said. Helped build it." "That correction happens every time," Walter said. "You qualify it every time. Why?" Elliot sat with that question. "Because it's accurate," he said. "Or because you were trained to make yourself smaller than you were," Walter said. "Those are different things." Elliot thought about Damon Cross calling the trust documents buried, about Mara's phrase, "She never reads anything," about 16 years of being the invisible machinery, the operational foundation, the man who handled the things that kept the company standing so that the person who stood in front of it could stand without thinking about what was underneath. "Both things can be true," Elliot said. "Yes," Walter said, "they can. But which one have you been living?" He didn't answer that day. He thought about it for the rest of the week. He was still thinking about it when December arrived. The divorce proceedings formally began in December, which was not a surprise. It had been coming since October, since the locks, since the chain on the door, and Mara's voice saying, "This is over," with the flatness of someone who had already grieved whatever she was ending and didn't need to perform the grief again. The attorneys communicated. There were documents. The process was not hostile, which was something, and the reason it was not hostile was that both of them had chosen, somewhere in those first weeks of difficult conversation, not to weaponize each other. Not out of sweetness, there was not a lot of sweetness in the situation, but out of a shared, exhausted recognition that the people who really weaponized each other in divorces were people who had run out of any better way to make themselves feel something, and both of them had plenty of other ways. The company questions were the most complex. Elliot's position in the Vance Legacy Trust, his founding equity, his ongoing role, all of it required careful handling, and Sandra and Mara's attorney worked through it across several weeks of back and forth that Elliot mostly stayed out of directly. The framework they reached was one he could live with. His equity interest was preserved, his role was formalized in writing in a way that his actual work had never been, and the trust authorization requirements were clarified in the company's governing documents so that nobody could build a plan around pretending they didn't exist. He signed those documents on a Thursday in Sandra's office, with the particular feeling of signing something that should have existed in this form years ago. "How do you feel?" Sandra asked after. "Like I'm signing documents," he said. She almost smiled. "That's the right answer." "What?" The trial date for Damon Cross was set for the following spring. Elliot would be called as a witness. He had known this was coming and had prepared himself for it in the same methodical way he prepared for things. He spoke with the prosecution's team. He reviewed his own records and recollections. He was honest about what he had known and when, and equally honest about what he had suspected and not acted on quickly enough. That last part was the part that required the most honesty, and he gave it without minimizing. A witness who presents himself as having done everything right is less credible than one who acknowledges the things he got wrong, and Elliot had gotten things wrong. He had seen warning signs in Damon's behavior earlier than the 48 hours before the board meeting. He had told himself stories about those warning signs for months. That was the truth, and he told it. The prosecution's team was satisfied. They had more than enough without needing Elliot to be a hero in the story. Eleanor Whitfield testified as a cooperating witness. Her testimony, when it came, Elliot read the reporting after the fact, because he was not in the courtroom for the days he wasn't scheduled, was, by all accounts, unsparing about her own role. She had known the money's origin was suspicious. She had told herself the story about investments because the alternative story was one she didn't want to be in. She had allowed that willful blindness to continue for 8 months, through a kitchen renovation and a car and 2 vacations she hadn't been able to afford otherwise. The judge's eventual comments during the sentencing phase would note that Eleanor's cooperation had been substantive and her accounting honest, which carried weight in the final determination of consequences for her role. She received a substantial fine and a period of supervised probation. Not nothing, but not imprisonment. Nora called Elliot the evening of that decision with a voice that was relieved in the complicated way of someone who had wanted justice and also wanted their mother to be okay and had not been certain those two things would be compatible. She cried, Nora said. In the car after. I was driving her home and she just cried. My mother does not cry. She's never cried in front of me. How was that? Elliot asked. Terrible, Nora said, and somehow the most honest I've ever seen her. A pause. She said she was sorry. To me, specifically. Not to the court, not to the abstract concept of accountability. To me, in the car. She said she was sorry for what she'd asked me to be silent about. What did you say? I said I know, Nora said, and then we drove the rest of the way without talking, and that was enough for now. That was enough to start with. Elliot thought about Eleanor in his office in the gray coat, about fear being the beginning of something real. Yeah, he said, it is. Damon Cross was convicted on all primary counts. The sentencing came in June, and it was significant, 7 years, with the possibility of earlier release contingent on restitution arrangements that his attorneys were already negotiating. The woman in Miami, whose name had been in Nora's photographs, and who had apparently expected Damon to arrive with a substantial amount of money that was not going to arrive, had cut contact before the arraignment, which was perhaps the least surprising development in the entire case. The $8.3 million, minus the amounts that had already been spent, was the subject of ongoing civil proceedings. Some of it would be recovered. Some of it would not. That was the nature of money that had been deliberately made difficult to follow. You could trace it, but tracing and recovering were different things, and the gap between them was where a certain amount of permanent loss lived. Vance Apparel absorbed that loss. It was painful, but the company was fundamentally sound enough to absorb it, which was, Elliot thought, itself a kind of evidence. A company built on a real foundation, not just a story about a foundation, can take a hit without collapsing. The foundation holds. The new distribution center opened in March, more than a year after the board meeting that had changed everything. It was a significant facility, 200,000 square feet in a logistics corridor south of Atlanta, serving the company's expanded regional market. The decision to build it had been made before any of the Damon situation, as part of a long-term growth plan that had been on the books for 2 years, and Vivian had decided to move forward with it once the audit was complete and the company's financial picture was stable enough to support the capital commitment. Elliot had worked on the financing for that facility for 3 months. The structure he'd developed was clean and favorable and had taken more negotiation than the initial projections suggested, because the company's recent history required more transparency with lenders than a company that hadn't just been through an embezzlement audit typically needed. He had those conversations honestly, and the lenders who had worked with Vance Apparel for years came through. The ones who hadn't worked with them before were more cautious, and Elliot was patient with that caution, because it was not unreasonable. The opening was a Thursday in March, cold and bright. The The kind of Georgia winter day that reminded you spring was actually coming even if it hadn't arrived yet. Vivian had organized a small ceremony, not a large public event, just the board members, key staff, and the people who had been involved in the construction and financing. A ribbon. Remarks. The practical acknowledgement that something real had been completed. There was a bronze plaque near the main entrance. Elliot had not known about the plaque until the morning of the opening, when Vivian mentioned it in a way that suggested she had been looking for the right moment to mention it, and had chosen this morning because there was no longer a reason to wait. The plaque listed the company's founding history and the people who had built it. Elliot's name was there. So was Mara's. So were the names of the 4 original employees who had been with them in the Auburn Avenue storefront before the company was anything more than a retail space with good bones and 2 people who believed in it for different reasons. He stood in front of it for a while. The metal was new enough to be sharp in the morning light, the letters deeply cut. He thought about what it meant to have your name on something. Not the legal version of that. He understood the legal version very well by now. But the human version. The version where your name on something meant you had been there. You had contributed something real. You had existed in the work in a way that left a mark. He had spent 16 years being the person whose name wasn't on things. Wasn't on the press releases, wasn't on the interviews, wasn't on the award citations when Mara accepted recognition for the brand she had built. He had told himself that was fine, that he wasn't interested in recognition, that the work itself was sufficient, that the quiet satisfaction of a well-structured deal or a clean set of books was its own reward. And some of that was true. He was not a person who needed an audience, but some of it had been a story he told himself to make the invisibility comfortable. And like most such stories, it had served its purpose right up until it didn't. Nora appeared beside him at the plaque. She had come with a colleague from her nonprofit work, had been somewhere across the facility for the first part of the morning, and had found him in the particular way she had of finding people, without announcement, without ceremony, simply there. "How does it feel?" she said, looking at the names. "Strange," he said. "Good strange." "You're allowed for it to just feel good," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm working on that." She looked at him sideways. "Walter's making progress." He almost laughed. He had mentioned the therapist to Nora once, months ago, and she had filed it and not brought it up since, which was very Nora. "Walter is Walter," he said. "High praise from you," she said. They stood at the plaque for another moment, and then the morning's practical requirements pulled them in different directions, and Elliot went to find Vivian because there were lender representatives at the event who he needed to introduce properly and be professional at, and the world moved on with its usual indifference to the fact that someone was having a significant personal moment in the middle of a Thursday. Mara was at the opening. He had known she would be. It was still her company, in the substantial ways that mattered, and she would not have missed an opening like this regardless of anything else. She had dressed carefully in the way she dressed for things that required her to be public without being performative. A dark coat, simple jewelry, the silver piece on the left side of her hair that he still noticed every time and probably always would. They spoke twice during the morning. The first time was brief and practical. Something about the lender introductions, a question about a name he'd forgotten, and she hadn't. The second time was longer, after the ribbon cutting, when most of the crowd had moved inside, and they found themselves near the entrance without having particularly tried to be near each other. "The plaque," she said. "Yes," he said. "Vivian did that," Mara said. "I want you to know I didn't. I wasn't the one who suggested it. Vivian came to me and said she wanted to do it, and asked if I had any objection." "Did you?" She looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "I didn't. I thought it was right." "It is right," he said. Not as a point of argument, just as a fact. She nodded. She looked at the facility behind him, the scale of it, the practical reality of 200,000 square feet of functioning infrastructure, the product of a long plan that had survived a great deal of disruption to arrive at completion. "We did something real," she said. "I don't think I fully understood how real until this year, until—" She stopped. "Until it almost didn't survive," he said. "Yes." She looked at the building. "I keep thinking about that, about how close it was, not just the acquisition, about how close I came to handing everything we built to someone who was going to take it and leave." She paused. "If you hadn't been there, if the trust hadn't—" "The trust was always there," he said. "We set it up together." You set it up, she said. I was in the room. He looked at her. Mara. I'm being honest, she said. That's what my therapist keeps asking me to be, and I'm trying. A small pause, rueful enough to be almost funny. It's very inconvenient, honestly. He almost smiled. How's it going? The therapy? Hard, she said. Better. She looked at him with the directness she'd always had, the quality that had never really left even in the worst of this year. She keeps pointing out that I built my identity around the company, and I let that become a kind of hunger, that I was so attached to the story of myself as the person who built this that I couldn't tolerate anything that complicated the story. That's not wrong, he said. I know it's not wrong, she said. That's the inconvenient part. She paused. She also points out that being a person who can walk into a room and make people believe in something is an actual gift, and that the problem wasn't the gift. It was thinking the gift was sufficient. That vision without foundation is just a building with no floor. He looked at her. She said that? I may have paraphrased. That's pretty good. She's pretty good, Mara said. Worth every inconvenient session. They stood in the cold March morning, and the facility hummed behind them with the ordinary sounds of a new thing beginning to function. And for a moment, it was almost like standing in the Auburn Avenue storefront before the first collection, the particular quality of energy that a thing has when it is new and not yet burdened by its own history. How are you? She asked. Not the polite version, the real one. Better than I expected, he said. Some things are harder than I expected. Some things are easier. What's harder? He thought about it. The apartment, he said. The silence. I didn't know I minded silence that much. I always thought I was someone who was fine alone. You are fine alone, she said. You're just also a person who spent 16 years not being alone, and that changes things. Yes, he said. What's easier? He thought about that too. Knowing what I'm working toward, he said. For a long time I was working toward us, the company, the thing we were building together. And that was real, and it had value, but it also meant that my own sense of direction was always partly borrowed from someone else's. And now, he paused. Now I know what I think about the work, about where I want it to go, about what kind of life I want to build. I don't have to negotiate those things against someone else's vision. She nodded slowly. There was something in her expression, not hurt exactly, but the particular quality of receiving information that is true and that carries some implications about the past. Was that how it felt? She said. Borrowed? Sometimes, he said. Not all the time. Sometimes it felt like partnership. Sometimes it felt like mine was the part that kept the lights on so your part could be visible. And I didn't mind that until I started minding it and didn't say anything. Why didn't you say anything? He had thought about this enough times by now that he had an honest answer. Because I didn't think it would change anything, he said. I thought I would say it, and you would hear it, and it would cause a fight, and then we'd go back to the same arrangement. I thought the arrangement was the deal, what we'd agreed to, even if we hadn't said it out loud. I would have wanted to know, she said. I think. I know, he said. I should have said it anyway. She was quiet for a moment. We were bad at that, she said. Both of us. Being honest about what we actually needed. We were good at a lot of things. We were, he said, and bad at that. Yes. The crowd inside the facility had reorganized itself into the configuration of a reception. Voices, movement, the clink of glasses being retrieved from somewhere. The practical requirements of the morning were reassembling themselves around the two of them, and in a few minutes they would both be absorbed back into them. I'm not asking to come back, she said. Not defensively, just clearly, so there was no ambiguity. I know, he said. I want... She stopped. Tried again. I want the company to be what we built. I want the people who work there to have what we meant to give them. I want the name on that plaque to mean something real. She looked at him. And I want you to be okay. Genuinely. Not because I owe you that. I do owe you a great deal, but that's not why. Because you were real. In a year full of people who turned out to be performing things, you were the thing that was actually there. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about 16 years. About Lake Lanier with the radio off. About the argument over the ivory color in August that she had been right about. about 1,000 ordinary Tuesday evenings that hadn't seemed significant and turned out to be the texture of a life, about locked doors and boxes on a porch, and the specific clarity that comes when someone removes something from you and you discover whether what's left is enough to stand on. It was enough. He knew that now with the particular certainty of someone who had tested it under real conditions. "I'm going to be okay," he said. "I already mostly am." She nodded. Something released in her expression. Not relief exactly, but the thing that comes after a question you've been carrying has finally been answered. "Good," she said. She went inside. He stood at the entrance for another minute in the cold March air and looked at the plaque with the names cut into it and the building that those names had helped produce. And he thought about what it meant to build something and then to keep going after the building was tested. He drove home that evening on the same highway he'd driven 100 times, the city doing its usual thing around him, indifferent and vast and full of people managing their own particular weight. He thought about everything that had happened in the 13 months since a rainy afternoon and a locked door and 4 boxes on a porch. He thought about what he had learned, and about whether the word learned was even the right one, since most of it wasn't new information. It was old information that had finally arrived in a form he couldn't refuse to look at. He had learned that silence is not the same as patience. He had been silent about things that needed to be said for years, and he had told himself the silence was patience, was generosity, was the reasonable accommodation of a partnership where 2 people had different strengths. But patience that never speaks is not patience. It is accumulation. It builds quietly and invisibly until the weight of what's accumulated becomes its own kind of structural problem. And by then it's harder to address than if you'd addressed it early, when it was still manageable. He had learned that invisible work is still work, that the person who keeps the lights on is not less essential than the person who performs under them, that a company, or a marriage, or any collaborative thing built by more than one person is not one story but several, and the stories told only about the visible parts are always partial, and partial stories leave gaps that other people can fill with whatever serves their purposes. He had learned that trust is not the same as inattention. He had trusted Mara. He had trusted the partnership, and because he trusted it, he had stopped paying attention to the signs that the partnership was being rewritten without his knowledge. Trust is not an excuse for not watching what's happening to the things you value. You can trust someone and still need to see clearly. Those are not mutually exclusive. He had thought they were for a long time, and that mistake had cost him more than a year of his life. He had learned, and this was the one that had taken the longest, that forgiveness is not reconciliation. They are separate acts, requiring separate decisions. He could forgive Mara for the locked door and the story she'd let herself believe in the year of accumulated erosion that had made her susceptible to Damon's version of events. He could forgive Eleanor for the willful blindness and the money and the 16 years of tolerant skepticism. He could even, in the way that required some distance from the immediate wound, understand Damon Cross as a person who had built his entire career on the premise that confidence and preparation were sufficient substitutes for integrity, and who had simply been wrong about that, with consequences that would take years to fully unfold. He could forgive all of it and still know that going back was not the answer. Not because of the damage. Damage, in his experience, was rarely as permanent as it felt in the immediate aftermath, but because going back required a willingness to inhabit a version of the past, and the past was not a habitable place. You could understand it, you could carry it, you could let it teach you things, but you could not live in it, and anyone who offered to take you back to it was offering something that did not exist. He did not know exactly what came next. He knew the apartment would eventually stop feeling temporary. He knew the work would continue, the vendor relationships, the financing structures, the invisible operational machinery that kept something real running, and that it would be his work, named and acknowledged in a way it hadn't always been. He knew Thursday dinners with Marcus would keep going until something changed them, which was the nature of rhythms. They continue until they don't, and then you find new ones. He knew that Nora would keep calling, and he would keep answering, because they had become, without exactly deciding to, 2 people who checked on each other. That was its own kind of structure. Not a dramatic one, not one that announced itself, just a regular human connection that showed up when it was needed and asked nothing theatrical in return. He knew that Mara would rebuild. She was already rebuilding. He had watched her do it across the months since October, watched her step back from the thing she loved and absorb the lessons of having loved it, in a way that had created vulnerabilities, and then turned toward what came next with the same energy she had always brought to new configurations of her room. Whatever she built independently, without the company as her primary identity, would probably be significant. That was simply her nature. He hoped it would make her happy in a way that the company, in its later years, perhaps had not fully done. He pulled into the parking structure of the Midtown apartment and sat in the car for a moment. He thought, a year ago, he had driven home in the rain on a Tuesday afternoon and found that the life he'd been living had been locked against him. He had stood on a porch in the rain with a laptop bag and a winter coat and the particular numbness of someone who has not yet understood what has happened to them. He was glad it had happened. That was the thought that surprised him, even now. The genuine, unperformed gladness. Not for the pain, which had been real and would not have been his choice, but for what the pain had done to the accumulated stories, cracked them open, forced an honest look at what was inside, given him back a self that was fully his, not borrowed, not constructed around someone else's vision, not invisible by agreement. He was 44 years old, and he was starting from somewhere real, which was better than he'd had and longer than he wanted to admit. He got out of the car and went upstairs. The apartment smelled of his own cooking now. He had been trying, with mixed results, to learn a few things beyond what he'd known how to make for the last decade. The kitchen had evidence of it, a cookbook he'd bought, some spices whose applications he was still working out, a cast iron pan that Marcus had told him he absolutely needed, and that had turned out to be correct. He made dinner without consulting anything and ate it at the kitchen table with the particular unhurried quality of a man who has nowhere he needs to be and no performance he needs to deliver. He thought about the plaque, about the names cut into the bronze, about all the people whose names were not on it, the ones who had loaded trucks and managed invoices and answered phones and sewn samples and driven deliveries and done the 1,000 other things that a company requires, without which the vision is nothing but a vision. He thought, the true story of anything built by people is always larger than the version that fits on a plaque. The plaque is shorthand. It points toward something. It says, here, in this place, people did real work. Come closer if you want to understand what the work actually was. He was glad his name was on it. He was glad of the names beside his. He was glad, in the complicated way of someone who has arrived somewhere genuinely difficult and gotten through it without becoming smaller, to be sitting in this kitchen on this March evening with this food and this particular version of his life. The cast iron pan needed seasoning. He had been meaning to do it for 2 weeks. He washed the dishes and dried the pan and set it on the burner with a small amount of oil and let it heat the way the internet had told him it should, standing in his kitchen in the ordinary silence of a Thursday evening that was his own. Outside, Atlanta was going about its business. Streets and lights, and the accumulated ordinary motion of a city that had not noticed what he had been through and would not, which was fine, which was exactly as it should be. The pan gleamed. He turned off the heat and let it cool. He went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept and did not dream of anything in particular, and woke up the next morning to the same apartment and the same work and the same life that was imperfect and incomplete and irrevocably, finally, his.